Welcome to this lesson package on the narrative text prepared by me. Now, narratives are used to entertain others, right? I mean, we all love to watch movies. Many of these movies are taken from stories, all right, written by others. At the same time, we also love to read, stories, right? We not just hear, but we also read stories. So these stories are actually written or spoken to entertain us. At the same time, when we write stories, we also use these stories to reflect on our life's experiences. And it can be spoken or written, as I mentioned earlier, and all these are known as stories. Now, stories, when written well, can be very compelling and very engaging. Narrative writing is characterized by a main character in a setting. Now, this main character in this story or in the story that's written is usually known as the protagonist. Protagonist. Now, this protagonist encounters a problem or conflict and then engages in an interesting or significant activity or experience. Now, it is very, very important for you to know that in a story, in an engaging story, in an effective story, there is always a plot. The plot of this story defines the sequence of events that propels the reader from the beginning to the end. The plot, as I said earlier, is an important aspect of a story. So remember, when you write a story, when you also tell a story, there's always a plot and a sequence of events. All right? The story develops and unfolds and moves in time with a development of the plot. And so the plot has a beginning, which is also known as the orientation, a middle, as well as the conclusion, which is also known as the resolution. Now, an effective story always has an orientation, which is the beginning or the start of the story. In this introduction or orientation, the story writer, okay, introduces the main characters in the story and the setting. In order to engage and hook the interest of the reader, we can actually have various strategies to start the story. And for rising action, that's the part where kicks a story main conflict. Now, in a very good story or an engaging story, there's always a problem or a conflict facing the main character. So the rising action is the one that actually kickstart the story's main conflict or complication or also the problem. Now the climax is the highest point in the story, and when that goes down is known as the falling action, where then the main characters will respond and processes to on the impact of it has on them. And resolution is the end of the story, or what is known as a conclusion, where the reflection also takes place. Okay, this is how the narrative structure will look like. All right, you set the scene, the orientation, then you have the problem or conflict, and then you have a rising action, you have the climax, the falling action, and the resolution. Okay, let's start also to reiterate the narrative structure, right? In narrative writing, you always have the beginning, which I mentioned earlier, is also known as the orientation, and then you also have the middle or the body content, which includes the events as well as the complication, and then the conclusion in narrative writing is known as the resolution. Now let's look at the language features, the narrative features of narrative writing. Now it's very important for effective narrative essays to have descriptive and figurative use of the language, right? Because you want the reader to to visualize and so to imagine. Therefore, you use descriptive and figurative language. All right. You also use your, the third person. All right. For personal narrative, personal is the first person narrative. But for the third person narrative, you are writing about other people's stories. All right. So it's the third person. You use pronouns like he or she. Whereas if you're writing your own personal narrative, then you will use I. All right. Now, narratives usually have dialogues, but they have to be used relevantly and appropriately, and also be very mindful of the use of tenses. Now, the middle of the story, which is the body, all right, is actually the largest, most significant part. It's usually also known as the main event. And this is where the story really is. After you've started the scene, after you've introduced the characters, the story moves on to the complication, the problem faced by the character, and then you have the rising action, then you have the climax and the falling action. So therefore, it is a very important aspect of the story. In fact, it is known as the most significant part. All right. And thus you have to write it well and think through on how you might want to craft this part well as well. Now for language features, action verbs are typically used, all right, to describe the character's actions. For example, she sang melodiously. He sprinted, to where the action was or to where the scene was, and so on. This is actually to highlight, to get the reader to visualize what are the main characters are doing. All right. Also, at the same time, we also use mental verbs, to actually get the writer, to get the reader to visualize what the main characters might be going through. Right. And also verbs and tenses and connectors, in a very, very effective manner. I would like you to read through this on your own, and then think of examples that you can use, to make that character come alive through the use of adjectives, adverbs, verbs, and also the use of tenses and connectors. So as mentioned earlier, all right, use appropriate adjectives to describe the setting, experiences of the characters. All right, describe the thoughts and actions. Show to the reader rather than just tell. Okay, it'd be good also if you can use similes, metaphors, literary devices, as well as adverbs, right, to indicate time, place, manner, and also the reason. So remember, know the skills, know the competencies and strategies of writing a good piece of narrative essay. And when you hone your craft, you can write a creative piece of narrative essay. Let me just end by saying that for this lesson package, it is on the structure of a narrative essay and the language features. In another module, we'll be looking at strategies on how to make your essay more interesting. For example, the strategies to start a story, the strategies to end your story, and how to make your story impactful by including, appropriate use of language. Okay, so that will be in another module. For this module, we are looking at language features as well as the structure of writing a narrative piece of essay. So go ahead and write a good piece of narrative essay.